Hello, everyone. Good to have you back on the program. This is an incredibly serious program, but it's relatively serious, I guess. How serious do you want to be? Only as far as seriousness takes you. It's only as far as it takes you there. Um, Let me talk to you about the best the best fast food product on the market right now, in my opinion, is if you go to Popeyes and get their fries. Popeyes fries and then dip it in their barbecue sauce. And that's the best product in fast food on the market right now. Their fries are amazing. I think, anyway, but that's a matter of opinion. Um, because not everybody would eat them and be like, whoa, those are some amazing effing fries. I can't wait to get more or something along those lines. The problem in the world is the collectivization of narratives and the timeline of Jesus. But I have talked about this before. The timeline of Jesus makes it so that we don't accept paranormal things because we have to fit everything in with one guy's story, and that guy's story doesn't necessarily include paranormal things or like ghosts that go against what it means for there to be a story at all. Ghosts, spirits of the deceased or that represent the deceased, paranormal spirits at all. These things exist in the periphery, but they are only ever in the periphery. They don't hit the mainstream because and they don't ever hit the mainstream because it's only ever like, oh, yeah, we don't believe you, is still the way that we talk about these paranormal things like ghosts and aliens, even though there's all this footage of UFOs. We're just like, yeah, well, there's no real evidence when there is evidence, but it's like we never say that it is evidence. We're like, no, that's not evidence. When people have footage of a UFO, we're like, ah, no, we don't believe it. Nobody believes it. That's because belief is centered around a like specific couple of religions, like mostly Judaism and Christianity. They're very that's where a lot of belief is captured. Belief is captured in all of the most mainstream religions, like Islam and Christianity. All the most like the mainstream religions are some of the most integrated entities on the earth. Like the integrity, the morality, the codes of conduct, the system of rules, the law. Some of the greatest law systems are not governments, they're religions, but they're like some of the greatest entities at all. But what's very interesting is that there are so many cultures that have existed throughout all of time, so many civilizations that have come and gone, and they faded into the annals of history. But we have history, and history is our word for it is his story, and coincidentally, we name it all after one guy because every event that happens historically is within the story of the timeline. That timeline is given a name of a guy. And so it's one guy's story also. It's his story. It's Jesus' story. And everything that happens just fits in with that. It's interesting there are all these cultures and civilizations that have come and gone with their own belief systems and their own values and their own religions. And it's just that certain religions get remembered the most to the point that they dictate all of history. And like literally history is dictated by a couple of religions through the Bible, I would argue. But what the point that I'm making, not that it needs to be a point, it's just kind of, it's true. It's a truism, and then you decide how true it is. The Genesis, when it was being written, was written by the Jews because this is what biblical scholars have agreed on. They agreed that around the 5th or 6th century BC is when Genesis was written. It was written by Jews in the Fertile Crescent area, but at the time, the Jews, I guess that's what you'd call them, right? You wouldn't say Israelites, the Hebrews maybe. The Hebrews were ruled by Persia at the time that they wrote Genesis, but the Persians were like, hey, we want you, the Jews, to be more autonomous. But in order for that to happen, you have to come up with a code of conduct that you all agree on. You have to come up with a unified code so that you can be ruled by something rather than, because the Persians wanted them to be autonomous. And so the Jews got together, the historical accounts that they knew the most. So they wrote this around 5th or 6th century BC, and they got together their historical records of their ancestors and how they came to populate the land there. And their records and their myths were like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the God of them, and that this God figure told them that they are going to have descendants greater than the grains of sand on the seashore or whatever. They're going to inherit all of this land. And these are group myths, but they're historical records, and they corroborate their stories with these genealogies that have specific years and all these specific names and specific places that all of these things happened. And so it's like they're a little bit better than myths, but so the Jews wrote Genesis and they wrote the other ones, I think, at the time. Actually, I don't know at what point. I was just reading about Genesis. I don't know at what point they wrote Exodus, but they came up with a unified code of conduct, which was, this is the basis for our religion and our belief system. It's like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just as far as we know historically, that all of that happened. But they're like, it's interesting that all of these cultures with all these religions have come and gone. Whatever ones were in Africa, you have like the Han Dynasty or the Hun Dynasty, whatever, Qin Dynasty, all the dynasties in China, all of these empires, the Aztecs, the Mayas, all these empires have sprung up all over the world for thousands of years, but there's only it's like the Jewish culture and the Jewish religion that gets remembered more than anything else, because the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible, in case you didn't know that. The Old Testament is a Hebrew Bible. They break it up into sections where they're like, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is the Pentateuch, and or the Torah or something. I think it's both of those words. That's the Torah. And then they have different names for what the Hebrews call the minor prophets and the major prophets. They categorize the Old Testament differently than like Christians would, but it's just that the Christian Bible is the entire Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament. So Jewish religion its basis is the Old Testament. Christianity's basis is the whole Bible. So like Christianity isn't an ethno-religion. It's like something that came later than the Jews, but like Judaism or the Hebrew Bible is sort of like the foundation for Christianity in some respects, you'd see, because what the Hebrews follow and listen to is the Old Testament. They call the Old Testament the Hebrew Bible. But it just talks about, or like it reveals the surface ability of Jews versus every other culture, or of Christians versus every other culture. Because there's all these other empires that have all of these gods that they become integrated at some point in history surrounding their god, or the energy that got all of them together, or just when an empire rises up, it's kind of this unnatural unification that happens across, like historically empires that have risen up. It's a somewhat unnatural unification or integration that happens across all these people so that they become unified across different belief systems, like like when the Han Dynasty happened in China, which is like one of the first dynasties, is like the second dynasty in China. I think it's the Han. It could be the Hun. It's difficult to remember. It's difficult to remember those things. Wait, one second. Let me look that up. I'm talking about the second dynasty of China. Like, there was one dynasty that was the first one to unite all of the disparate states in China under one name. There is one dynasty. There's like the first one. The first one was the Qin Dynasty, and it's spelled Qin. So the Qin Dynasty, I'll just use that as an example. The Qin Dynasty was the first dynasty to unite all of the peoples in the area in like what today is called China, and a lot of scholars believe that that's why we call it China today. It got its origins from this first dynasty that was able to unite all of the people, because before they united them, all of those states were just warring with each other in like a game of Risk to decide which state would control the entire thing. But there's like, at some point an empire rises up, but it rises up as a result of the integration of all of the previously separated states of China into one name, and it's basically the result of the vision of a guy. In most cases, for most empires, it's like one leader, and then when that leader dies, the dynasty dies in a lot of empires across the world. Or it's like when the leader dies, you're going to have such a new era or a new reign for your empire now that it's almost like sometimes they change the name of it, or like have to, because of the new ruler. But I'm saying that an empire gets created and it gets integrated, but it's like the empire that is Judaism is, what that speaks to is the memorability or surfaceability of Judaism as a culture versus all other cultures. But it's and so what is the reason for that? Why did the Jews get remembered? But I'm saying like the Jews are now so much more remembered than basically any other culture, like 99.9% of all other cultures, because we have the Bible today as an account. It's just like in everybody's home. Like the epitome of Jewish culture is just it's like everybody, tons of people have Bibles. It's just readable and available to everybody. And also it's the most popular and most money-making book of all time, I think. Yeah, like the Bible, and it's like half of it is just Jewish culture, but it's like been given to everybody, or it's been memed to everybody. Like Jews are the most memorable, or the most able to be memed, or something, to that you see that the basis for their culture is just in the Bible and is in everybody's home. But like this gets remembered to the point that this is like, I know that Jews don't believe in Jesus. And there are some that do, but then you consider the rest of the Bible, and that is what is the basis for Christianity. But it is sort of the case that Christianity has more visibility than Judaism today. But maybe Judaism or Jewish beliefs are sort of the basis for Christianity. Because you don't have the rest of the Bible without the Old Testament, but it's like a unified code of conduct. That's what a lot of Genesis is. It's a unified code of conduct that the Jews got together to write so that they could unify their culture under one set of rules and one set of laws. But like this set of laws presented in Genesis is law for the Jews, or at least one of the furthest back codes of laws that we have, and it still survives to this day. But it's an empire, and it speaks to their surfaceability, but it's just like if you read Genesis, this is why I would say maybe this is why it survived for this long, is because their myths don't sound very mythical. But if you read Genesis, it's pretty straightforward, and in their stories they throw in a lot of things that you wouldn't know how it fit in with the story necessarily. Just things that people said or dialogue among the characters in the stories. It's like they're just throwing in things that are extra that it's like you wouldn't very easily see how that supports a myth, or how it's not very propagandizing because it's not very glamorous, that like the things presented in the Bible. Like I feel like other cultures might propagandize their leaders in more mythical ways where they're really laying it on. But the thing about Genesis is, like, what the Jews created in writing it is it's pretty it's pretty believable, is the thing. But it's like that's probably the reason why it has survived so much, is the Jews have a way of being more believable apparently than all other cultures. But it's like the story that's presented in Genesis is very believable because of the genealogies that they give in support of it. Like it's pretty, like it's not very good for reading, but it supports the story. But it's like to the point that you would read that and believe it. You would believe that about, like, oh, God came to Abraham and Isaac, even though that sounds like completely supernatural. They write the whole book of Genesis when they wrote this, how like more than like 2,500 years ago. They wrote the whole book in a pretty believable way, to the point that you would just think that, oh, these are cultural things, even though they're saying it's something completely supernatural. But it would appear, but truthfully, honestly, they have created the most believable story because their culture is the one that has surfaced more than any other culture. And it's like in Christianity, then Christianity takes that and does the same thing. So I guess you'd have to say that Christianity is stealing Judaism a little bit, because they're just like lock, stock, and barrel. The entire Hebrew Bible is subsumed into the Christian Bible. Like lock, stock, and barrel, they're like they just totally compounded their religion with Judaism when you recognize that the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible. But like Bible scholars noted that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, like it's not corroborated anywhere in the rest of the Bible. Like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this isn't in the first 10 or 11 chapters. Like the first 11 chapters is like Noah and the Tower of Babel and creation, but these chapters and what goes on in them is not really mentioned very much in the whole rest of the Bible. And so biblical scholars came to the conclusion that the first 11 chapters of Genesis were written after the 5th or 6th century BC, but maybe 1 or 2 centuries later, maybe 1 or 2 centuries later, after this code of conduct part of Genesis was written by the Jews that got together to write it. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are not as much mentioned in the rest of the Bible, but biblical scholars think that whoever it was that wrote it, they got together because they needed to slap on an origin to it, so that it wasn't just like, oh, this started happening where there were generations of Jews or something. Like, now that there's an origin, somebody had to slap on an origin to make this thing a story, and they did it later on than what they did when they wrote the rest of Genesis. But it's like what they did, they corroborated the truth of like they made their story really believable and truthful by including a lot of genealogies, but also they talk about the generations of things. Like there's the generations of Abraham, there's the generations of Esau, or the generation of whatever. Like Genesis takes an aside to bring up all of the genealogies of their like myth of the heroes of the Jewish culture. But in the beginning of it, they use the same phraseology apparently for generations that they use for, like, these are the generations of Abraham. They use the same phraseology for when the earth is created and when the earth gives birth to all of these different trees with different fruits and like plants and rivers. The fertilization of the earth, the fertility of the earth, is described in the same terms. Like Genesis is about generations, and like either 10 or 11 times there's a phrase that introduces the generation of somebody. Like there's this phrase that's like, oh, this is a generation of Abraham, but the same phrase is used for, oh, this is the generation of the earth, or like the fertility of it when the earth gave birth to all of these things like trees and plants and animals and rivers. And so the point being, Genesis is a self-contained book that's defined by generations, but they liken the generations of people to like the way that the earth gives birth to all of these animals, or like that's the origin of it, or that's the beginning. So Genesis is defined by generations. But what's interesting is that the Jews were also right with the God that they're describing, whoever this figure is, whatever is written, whatever God means in the Bible or in Genesis, whatever God that the Jews are talking about, this guy who gave these messages to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wasn't even lying, because of the influence and impact of Jewish culture for the entire world is such that everybody knows it, everybody is influenced by it, everybody is like, it's completely memorable and completely in everybody's lives. People get circumcised that aren't Jews. Tons of people are getting circumcised that aren't Jews, when it's like that's part of the Jewish covenant, or that's what, according to God, that's what makes you a Jew, or that according to God, what makes you a descendant of Abraham is if you get circumcised, according to Genesis. And there's tons of people that aren't Jewish that get circumcised, and what would you say that is besides the result of the influence of Jewish culture, besides that the popularity of Jewish first names for tons of people, including myself, that aren't Jews? And it's like Abraham has all of these descendants that he's not even related to, but like the memorability of Jewish culture and the influence of it and the wealth that is generated off of it is true and lasts for a very long time, like almost in the same way that God described it would be true. But like the heritage or the tradition that was started with Judaism and with this God telling these things to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the tradition of that is so powerful that it's like basically alive and well today, that we're like, people are reading this Bible and judging their lives and other lives by it pretty significantly, like all the time. And like way more so than the impact of any other of these cultures or empires that just come and go, but didn't create the Bible, or like didn't create the code of conduct that the entire rest of the world is still judging to be profoundly significant. So it's weird that God guy is correct, but there's too much collectivizing of narratives. I like to talk now about it's just like empires are, here's the thing about it. Let me take a swig of this coffee. This is the only podcast where I'm going to explain my pauses to you when I break for something. Breaks are totally worth it. Watch out for Jordan Peterson. That guy's a mystic. Don't get caught up in the lies of Jordan Peterson. He's a scary guy. I mean, he's something like he's scary. He's pretty moral, but I mean, I would say that a lot of his message is to follow what's interesting to you. I would totally agree with that. It's just that following what's interesting to you, it's like listening to what God has laid on your heart. I believe in God, and it's just that there are things of the future, and that's what I think is what God is. Or it's like you can call it the voice of God if you want to, because what else would you call it? Because you don't know what would be calling you to do the things that you want to do. Besides, it's like the voice of God, or it's kind of like it's biological that you end up with a series of things that's like, I could translate myself through the medium of this field of life, and by that I mean like become a physicist. I can communicate myself through physics if that's what I like, or that I'm drawn to that field. Um, so people are interested in different things. You should follow your interests. And I think that it's true that you or I or anybody already knows what is interesting to ourselves. It's just that you can deny that it's interesting, or you can chalk it up to a secret, or you can make it secretive. Like, there's probably a lot of things that I or anybody wants to do that's like, it's not, you wouldn't know how it would be received by the rest of the world, and so then you just keep it to yourself, or it becomes a secret. But unfortunately, what results is all of these things get put into a secretive world that are things that you like, or things that you like, or things that you want to do, that you have to chalk them up to a secret, or make them exist in the peripheral or imperceptible world. And it's just that when we collectivize our narrative behind one guy, the history, and it's Jesus's history, then there's no room for the story of other planets or the story of other alien forms of life. And then when there is evidence of that, then we're like, oh, that's not evidence. It's because there's too many layers of narration that exist above us as regular people that might come forward with a paranormal account of something. There's too many levels of narration that exist above us that we have to fit our narratives into, because the narrative always gets collectivized. Because if like I was the result of some negative thing that happened, and then I tried to tell people my side of the story later on, it's like that doesn't get any credit. What gets credit is the law. Historically, the law is what gets credit at the end of the day. People have to collectivize their narrative for an event that happened, and the energy surrounding an event. It has to be put into a category, like it has to be in terms of the law at the end of the day, because otherwise, if there's disconnected accounts of something that happened, we have to find justice, and if you don't, then it doesn't count. It doesn't become a story. It doesn't become a memory if it's not. Like, the more unified that something is the better chance it has to become a memory, become a story. And so people want to be remembered. And so when you're part of something that's like a social gathering with lots of people, your individual account of things is not very important and is not what gets remembered. What gets remembered for any social gathering is the group narrative of a memory. Like, it's very difficult to change the narrative of a memory once it's been like agreed upon. You can't really, it's kind of out of bounds to try to reconstruct the memory years later, but I guess you can, after many years, like, reconstruct how a memory went down if enough people don't remember it. But like, people want things to be remembered that they're taking part in, and so people need to coerce each other into saying it went down a single way so that there is a story, because if there's disconnected accounts of it, it's not integrated and it's not moral. Something that happened, like an account, like a memory, oh, this crazy thing happened at this party. There's generally a narrative that people agree on. And then if you disagree, especially at if the joke is on you, nobody's going to take you seriously. You just have an alternative narrative. Your narrative could be true. It's just that it doesn't matter what anybody's individual narrative says. The only thing that matters historically is the law, and the law dictates certain things about right and wrong. Like, it's right to, like, the law will help dictate to everybody in the group how the narrative should be constructed. So there's laws in place, and where do they where do they emanate from necessarily? I don't really know. But I wanted to bring up a point about empires. It's a point I'm making about empires. And there's like I'm trying to, why did I go off and talk about that? I'm talking about how things come down to narratives. Like a basketball game has all of these narratives involved. Like I watched the Iowa State Wisconsin basketball game. What happened was Iowa State outplayed Wisconsin and they won. But as a good sports fan, because I watch these games, and then like the game happens and everybody kind of has a memory of it, and even though it's watched by this many different million of people, there's generally a singular narrative that results, and then like there are like for a event that's watched by more people, there's more chance for alternative narratives to describe it, you know. But it's like it's kind of more of a phenomenon if more people agree with a single way that it happened. But because I want to be in the group of sports fans, like I want to be a good little sports fan, I have to follow the rules of what I have to follow what the rules say about how we collectivize narratives. So I'm going to be like, Wisconsin was outplayed by Iowa State. That's why they lost, because that's all like unfortunately, what happens on the surface accounts for so little of what actually happens. But it's like, I'm saying that the single narrative that results is kind of like the most surface level, the most popular, the easiest one, so that it doesn't complicate things. So the most people can be unified in describing what happened, then everybody can have a shared memory or something. So, but it's like there's actually a lot of alternative narratives you could describe how something went down. It's just that you're not going to go into it, and it's not credited to you because people like to go by the law and be able to tell you that you're right and wrong about things. But this Iowa State Wisconsin game is this is a picture or a piece of evidence, I would say, for a team that did poorly when they had a home crowd because of the home crowd. But I want to make the point that Wisconsin partially lost that game because of their home crowd, because they're playing at home in front of like thousands of screaming fans. I don't know that maybe it's a matter of like teams themselves or players themselves are maybe more open to reacting negatively to a positive home crowd. Maybe that's more possible now than it used to be 15 years ago as a result of there too inundation of expectations that a positive crowd will cause you to play better. Like, it's kind of assumed that a home crowd helps you out, and in most cases they do. It's just that do not ignore that there are some players and teams and coaches or even organizations themselves that might react negatively to a positive crowd. So you might think that I'm crazy, but I'm just trying to go into some of the alternative narratives that would never result for the narrative. Like Wisconsin lost that game, they got outplayed. That's what you have to say. The refs are never to blame. These are the things that everybody agrees on. The refs were not to blame for Wisconsin losing. I would say that the reason they lost is because of Brad Davison. This is not to take away from Brad Davison. This is Wisconsin, Iowa State March Madness game, round of 32. In case you don't follow it at all, they're down to 32 teams, but this is a single elimination basketball tournament. Anybody could win it. So it's like Wisconsin in losing in the round of 32. They do have the opportunity to win the whole thing because anybody can win it. But so this was an upset. Wisconsin lost to Iowa State, and Wisconsin has a player named Brad Davison, and he gets a lot of negative media attention during the course of his career at Wisconsin. I would say that he is at fault for why they lost, but I'm not Like, I'm not angry about that. It's just kind of, that just is what goes along with the kind of energy that Brad Davison brings to the table, is that he assumes too much responsibility. Because let me tell you what I saw when I watched this game, is that I saw Brad Davison very many times, over and over again. It was Brad Davison. Like, he made a lot of appearances in this game. There are certain games that happen where Brad Davison makes too many appearances, but he's actually good at memeing himself, or making appearances, or being popular somewhat because the media likes him. The media brings up Brad Davison a lot. Media sources do, mostly negatively. Mostly they don't like him. They don't like his attitude on the court. He generates a lot of buzz for some reason. He's good at making appearances. And this was one of those games where Brad Davison was making a lot of appearances, but like, he, during certain times in his time at Wisconsin, and I think he played 5 years, they had teams where they actually needed to rely on Brad Davison, but Brad Davison isn't that talented. He's a little bit try-hard, Wisconsin Badger, quintessential try-hard kind of player, and really not somebody who should be relied on. But like, certain times Wisconsin was bad enough they had to rely on Brad Davison during the course of his career. But he, in this game, he was making a lot of appearances. He had his hand in everything, and also was the connection between the crowd and the teams on the floor, and the Badgers and the basketball team. He was the connection between the crowd and the team, because the rest of the team was not making motions to the crowd to rev them up, or the rest of the team was not visibly paying attention to the crowd. Brad Davison was acknowledging the crowd and communicating with them, but it's like, some people are more of a merchant, a medium, like marketable. Some people are more marketable, and they are able to assume responsibility for more groups of people, or they're just kind of a go-between for more groups of people, like they're more unidentified or something, is probably what causes you to be memorable. And so Brad Davison is able to talk to the crowd, he's able to talk to the refs, he's able to talk to the other team, the coaching staff, his own players. Doesn't mean that he does it well. But it's like, Wisconsin losing and getting upset in the round of 32 was and them losing, and like, Brad Davison had his hand in everything. Like, he was trying to do too much. And this, I would say, is why they lost, because that can very easily happen when somebody is trying to do too much. It makes everybody worse. But there's a certain pressure that was happening from the home crowd onto Brad Davison, who, during the course of his career, I would say has a disjointed relationship with the crowd, that then causes him to try to get more charges and fouls and be everywhere, because he's kind of a people pleaser. And this can be really grating for the rest of the team. It made him not a team player, even though he was trying very hard, to like, doing everything in his power, trying very hard, being everywhere to try to win the game. This didn't help the team, because this team was actually good enough that they didn't need him. I was taken aback. I was surprised that Brad Davison reverted to Brad Davison mode, where he thought that he needed to do everything on his own, when this team is actually better than him. He just made it all about himself and took the team down with him, I would say. And that's just a good performance, what I say to that when that's over. Like, oh, they lost as a result of him. I'm like, oh, that's a good performance, Brad Davison, because that final game was a picture of your entire career at Wisconsin. A lot of potential, but the negative energy, like, Brad Davison has negative enough energy that a lot of the potential doesn't make its way out, that they are actually able to translate that potential into wins when it matters most. That hasn't happened during Brad Davison's career. I mean, that's the end of an era at Wisconsin basketball, an era that is most defined by Brad Davison and his performances like that, where he made lots of appearances and talked a lot, talked back to the refs and to the crowd, and was the most visible person, but it didn't translate into wins. That's definitive of an era, and that's just you can't credit anybody but Brad Davison for the whatever relatively shitty level of play that's been displayed from Badger basketball in the last 5 years. But it's like, it might be Brad Davison, it might be their coach, Greg Gard. But regardless, this Wisconsin team during the course of the year played very poorly at home in games that they should have won, and then all these games on the road or on neutral courts against really tough teams, they won a lot of them. This team during this year, and this is a fact, was more comfortable on the road than at home. And what I saw from this game, where they were at home, like basically they're in Milwaukee, and everybody in the stands, it was like a 90% Wisconsin crowd or whatever. What I saw on the floor was a team rushing a lot of passes and rushing a lot of shots as if they were under the gun of a bunch of people that they needed to please. And I think that they reacted negatively to the home crowd. And this needs to be spoken about more in sports, that this is a possibility, or it's like, recognize that when that happens. The home crowd actually played a big factor in them losing, because at some point when everybody is going crazy because of March Madness, everybody's going nuts anytime you make a 3 or a 2. You're like, well, we have to... I mean, if you just happen to have a mentality that reacts negatively to expectations, which is like Wisconsin Badger football and basketball has always had a negative relationship to expectations, wherein they perform better when they aren't expected to. And that's like, it's not really been the case for Wisconsin basketball to perform negatively in front of home crowds. They've actually done very well in front of home crowds in the past, especially during the Bo Ryan era. It's not characteristic of them. It's just that I think Wisconsin basketball has risen to this higher level over the years, where, I mean, generally sports kind of has, where we're in a society that it's more difficult to find what it is that's integrating all of us. But I feel like over the years, there's been more pressure put on Wisconsin basketball, wherein its origins are, we don't put any pressure on this, and that's why it used to be easy for them to win at home. But maybe this is something that's happening across all of sports, but there's definitely these trends that happen in, there's these trends that happen in March Madness, are like this trends that happen according to the crowds and crowd narratives, that it's like, we often don't get the opportunity to explore what might be happening under the surface of it, because we have to be good sports fans and remember that the refs are the best thing that God has given to us, and they're never wrong. And so I watched March Madness, and the CBS broadcasted all of it, and they basically agreed with the refs in 100% of circumstances. And when the refs made blatant errors, they just ignored them. Like, they'll throw in a couple times where they're like, I disagree with the refs, but the common denominator for the broadcasters is to agree with the referees, like, over and over and over again. And it's disgusting, but because you're not allowed to question the refs, and it has to do with that, like, well, what gets remembered is the win or the loss, and it doesn't matter how it happened, you got outplayed, rather than that you're going to respect an alternative narrative that, like, oh, the refs did it. That has never gone mainstream, and that's part of my problem with the referees, is that there has never been, we've looked back on a game and everybody, well, it's like, I guess a couple times, yeah. A couple times it has happened, like in baseball, when it's really obvious, like when Galarraga, or when that one umpire took away the perfect game and he was just like dead wrong, and everybody knew it. That one was obvious. It's just like, it's so seldom that the group narrative becomes, oh, the referee was wrong. You're not allowed to do that. And that's the problem I have with it. That's the problem I have. It's like, oh, aliens were never true, even though people have all these videos of it. It's because we have to fit it in with a story, and because the world is very story-oriented, like finite-oriented. It's like, it's the same as a world that stigmatizes death. Think about how stigmatized death is, because of you think of the one that causes you to be gone forever, to the point that people are not really considering death characteristically or relatively. That you're like, what is death? Like, if you were to hear from it, or like the energy behind death itself, like death itself, you're not going to consider that, because anytime anybody's thinking about death, they're thinking about the absolutist, like, oh, now you're gone from the earth. But it's like, if you were to hear from death a little bit, that might actually benefit you. And what I'm saying is, like, consider the nature of death or of dying as what you are, or it's that you can become different things or go into different worlds or live in different places. It involves dying as what you used to value. Like, like, it's okay to change your value system, but death is so stigmatized that you wouldn't go into the direction of like listening to it, or saying that it's okay, that it's like justifiable, or like rationalizing. Like, don't rationalize death, or don't personalize it. Don't make it relatable at all, because it's always the scariest thing ever. Like, if you're going to think about death, you have to think about in the worst terms, like the one that when you're dead. When it's like death is relative, but just the world is so stigmatizes death so much, it has to do with the same thing, where it's like any event that happens, we have to look back on it as we all agree on it, because it has to be a story, because that's the only way that things get remembered, or how they exist. And it has to do with that overarchingly, we have a story that's going on. It's the story of Jesus that collects all historical events on one timeline and puts them all in one story. And like, this is a fashion that influences us, influences fashion, and influences the way that we format our lives, is the collectivizing of stories. I would say that you could point to that the one story as the generator of all of that kind of behavior. The Jesus story, history, and it's one guy, and so we're always, but like this, I'm saying that you point to that as the reason why all of this story behavior is going on. But it's like, this would cause you to stigmatize death, or just give too much power to the ending of something and the origin of something, in the same respect as that we have this story, and there's like a point of reference. Like, we're not like, even evolutionists are like, well, 500 million years BC, before Christ. Like, I think it causes people additionally to stigmatize the origin of things, where, like, as long as it's story world, finite world, instead of infinite world, instead of very many narratives exist at one time, very many stories exist at one time. It's kind of just like, we often have to remember things as one story, so that we further ourselves in the world, so we have the opportunity to be remembered. But like, the origin of things gets stigmatized. Like, I don't know that there was necessarily an origin for anything, because like, there's the origin for me, but there's just all these generations of people that created me. Like, is there really ever an origin? I don't know how you could say there is an absolute origin, but that's what science has been describing with some of their most popular theories that have come out in the last 200 years. In other words, evolution and the theory of relativity, which say similar things. Evolution is similar to the theory of relativity, but it's like, they're talking about how life itself is relative, rather than like the theory of relativity. As long as we agree on that is scientifically true, it disproves that there's an absolute time, because it says that time is only relative. It exists all these relative times. And it's the same with evolution. Evolution says there wasn't, it says more that there wasn't an absolute origin, like the Bible would say. There's this absolute origin. It came from God. But even that, you would have to question. You would have to say that God, since we don't know about that he had his own origins. That's always like the argument, or like, what did it really come from? I think that with relativity and evolution, because evolution describes how species are all relative to each other or exist, like the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You can look at a tree and see how all of that is pictured all at once, where kingdom is the most generalizing, that's the base of the tree. And then the tree creates all of these derivatives into branches and twigs that are derivatives, they're replicas of the original of the base of the tree. They're derivatives of it, or they take on the same form. They're like these likenesses in the form of branches and twigs that are created off of the base of the tree as the tree grows. All of these derivatives, all of these specialized things, like that's when you get to the ends of the tree where all of the twigs and leaves are, this is the species level of kingdom, phylum, class, order. But the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species classification classifies every species that evolution says was created. But evolution is saying that everything is like a tree, where evolution actually says that mammals branched off of or are a derivative off of reptiles. Reptiles are older than mammals. Reptiles existed before mammals were even created, let alone before mammals became the dominant class of species. Reptiles existed at a time where there is a completely different class of species that was dominant even before mammals existed. But you would say that reptiles are closer to the base of the tree. They're like a common ancestor for mammals and then for anything else that branched off of reptiles. But basically evolution says reptiles came before mammals, and coincidentally all of these religions have all of these creation myths and stories that are like, oh, we came from a snake, or a snake gave birth to us, which is like corroborates evolution. Even the Bible does it. The Bible says that we received this knowledge from the tree of good and evil, humans did, and then at that point, the new rules as presented by God were that that we defeat the snake now. With the snake is below us, we're dominant over the snake. We crush the snake's head, but it bites our heel, like it doesn't. But that speaks to relativity. Snake does still relatively get us back a little bit. It's not completely dominated, which is exactly how it exists now. Snakes are relative to humans, is what I'm saying. That's what evolution says. All of these species that result that we see now, they're all relative to each other because there is some original thing way far back that we all branched off of, but it speaks more to relativity with regard to origins themselves. But like that's the Bible even corroborates evolution in this respect, where it says that in this new world that like this the beginning of the Bible is describing, that it's like the Bible is going into this whole account kind of as a result of, well, now we're in this new world where we sinned. Then the Bible goes and does its whole thing. But in the new world that results from us sinning, now we are dominant over snakes, where it's like apparently we weren't before, but that's the way that it was in evolution. We were not dominant over snakes, they were dominant over us, or at least it was equal, and then mammals came to be dominant over reptiles, where they came from them. But all humans have a reptilian brain as picture of, and so I guess I don't really know what that entails, or I don't know the extent of what the reptilian brain influence is, but that's what they call it. But it's because that's like the reptile, just the reptile, like the part of us that just acts like a snake, and that's within everybody, the same way that we are dependent on reptiles, historically speaking. I don't know, why did I launch into that? Just Brad Davison, he's the reason. But like, you watch that game, you see that Brad Davison had his hand in everything, and yeah, like I'm saying, we result in, we collectivize our narratives, and so like the Bible is the most. We live in this world that collectivizes narratives. Maybe it's completely influenced by the Bible, but regardless, all historical narratives of all cultures do exist. Like the Songhai Empire has its own historical records that propagandizes the Songhai Empire. Any empire does, has its own historical records that propagandize themselves. All of those civilizations exist and are part of the narrative, and are the narrative just as much as the Jewish one is. It's just that certain qualities exist with the Jewish narrative, or with Jews themselves, their ethnicity, their culture, that makes them, in some respects, the best, you would have to argue, because of the influence that they've had, or because their culture survives for years and years and years and is shared to everybody, where all of these other cultures are just alternative narratives that get forgotten by history. But like the Jews are better at collectivizing a narrative, but I'm saying that then Jews, characteristically, they surface better, they're better at being popular than all of these other cultures that were like something like less of a phenomenon than Jews. But I would chalk it up to has to do with their believability. They create a story that is believable, and then all of these religions spring up because they're centered around belief or the believability of something. And so it's like, it's because of like, read Genesis, it sounds authentic. Like, I know that it says like sort of mythical or supernatural things. I'd say like the authenticity of the story says something. But they're watching March Madness, and Gonzaga is this power. In case you don't watch college basketball at all, but you've heard of Gonzaga, I'm sure. The thing that's happening in college basketball over the last 20 years is that you have the powers of college basketball, which are like Duke, North Carolina, Kentucky. And then slowly over the last 20 years, this other power has risen in the West, and it's like an empire. We have empires today. It's just that the world is very intelligent now, so the world is very intelligent now, and so it does not explain the energy of an empire, it explains the energy of empire more through enterprises, or empires are more decentralized and more individualized. We still have empires, it's just that we're so intelligent that we divert the energy for that into all of these different avenues. The world is so connected, and trade is more ubiquitous. Trade of information and of cultural events. Cultures are all interdependent on each other now, more so than they used to be. And so you don't have like an empire. my voice keeps giving out because I'm a voice outer, I'm a voice giver outer. I'm not being my authentic self. I'm not saying it with enough gusto that I allow my voice to give out. Doesn't matter. So anyway, what I'm talking about is Gonzaga and the power of their empire. But it's like, this is the same thing as an empire. It's just that, like an empire like the Qin Dynasty, the Qin Empire, that rises up and unites all of China. It used to be geographic. Whatever, like, the thing is that all of these people get united and behind, like, a guy that is their leader, that they're treating as God. And this same thing happens today. It's just very specified. It can only happen in specified ways, because we're smart now, because we know that, because it's just like more low resolution, or it comes from a more ancient time or a more mythical time. Like, it's more mythical for all of like an empire to take place over just this particular space of land, this geographic space of land, where all of the cultures of the people are united. It's more like spiritual or something. But we're too intelligent now, and so there's too many avenues through which you communicate energy or connectedness itself or integrity itself. And so Gonzaga is like this empire. It's just empire in the medium of college basketball. But you so you have Duke and North Carolina and Kentucky. These are centralized powers. the NCAA gets a lot of flack, but it is, at the end of the day, pretty open-minded and inclusive, because the NCAA for college basketball has 350 Division I teams, and they include new teams all the time. It's not like the NBA, where it's very difficult to include a new team. Like in the NBA, all of the teams in the NBA are more beholden to the NBA as an organization. Teams in the NCAA Division I are beholden to the NCAA, yes, but they are not, they're more it's up to them whether or not they're successful, more so for a university, because it has to do with that the universities already existed before the NCAA came along to try to coordinate all of the universities under one name or one league. It's just the NCAA, there are so many more teams, everything is, and conferences, everything is very decentralized on its own. But even in a decentralized system like Division I basketball, whereas Division I NCAA basketball, where there's 350 universities that compete, or colleges that compete, you have centralized powers that run things, but there's the opportunity for other ones to rise up. And what's happened in the last 20 years is that this power, this empire, Gonzaga, has risen up in the West. I would say that it has something to do with their Christianity, honestly. But I don't want to rub people the wrong way, because people probably won't believe me. They won't believe what I am going to say about Gonzaga. But I just like, the thing is that Gonzaga, whether or not you want to admit it as a sports fan, they affect the referees more than any other, more so than other teams. But different energies of different coaching staffs or different fan bases, different teams, different fan bases, different coaching staffs all have different energies, and they have different relative ways of affecting the referees. The referees are not God, they're people, and so they are affected by what happens. In fact, in basically every game, it's the referee's job to appease the crowd, and so they call things for the crowd when the crowd is yelling at them. This is a fact. And so they are more affected by some fan bases than other ones. But Gonzaga, over the last few years, I don't know that it's always been like this, but over the last few years, referees call things for Gonzaga. It's to the point that I don't know that I'd want to pick against Gonzaga, because their crowd affects the referees so much that it's difficult for any team to win. For example, Gonzaga was losing to Memphis. Memphis was a better team than them in this past weekend in March Madness, and Memphis was dunking on them and doing whatever they wanted, and then, something changed in the second half where all of Memphis's best players were in foul trouble by like 14 minutes left in the game, like sort of early in the second half, early enough. All of Memphis's players were in foul trouble. None of Gonzaga's players were, and this happens all the time over the last 2 or 3 years for Gonzaga. Is that all of the team that they're playing, that team's players all get into foul trouble, and the referees generally call the game for Gonzaga. They tried to give Gonzaga the championship last year, and it's just that Baylor won, because Baylor was so much better than them. Baylor was ahead by 15 the entire game. The refs were unable to give the game to Gonzaga. You probably would think that, well, the refs could never hand a game to anybody, or that would be too insignificant a factor. But I mean, if you're giving one of the teams foul trouble, so they have to take all their best players off the floor, it would be easy enough to control a basketball game, because there's not a lot of depth on Division I rosters, really. There is not. They're relying on 3 guys a lot of the time. There's 3 guys that can score on most teams. And so when you put all of those guys in foul trouble and they're off the floor for a lot of the game, and when it's so easy to get out of a college basketball game, 5 fouls, it's so easy to rack up fouls. Basketball game, the referees could control any game that they wanted if they were really choosing to. And so what would I say is they should get rid of the referees? Well, maybe they could, because the players could referee the game just as easily. I don't know that you need the referees. But I know that you're not going to care because that's too alternative a narrative that I would really like advocate for getting rid of the referees. The players could referee a basketball game on their own. And so you'd be like, well, but then there would be players that take advantage of that and say it's a charge every time. But there's like, as we all know, the people who are assholes get outcast. They get jettisoned out of the system. They're like, the people who are assholes don't get credit, they're not popular, and they will not fit in with the crowd of people playing if it becomes obvious that they are just calling a lot of fouls that didn't happen. They will be shut out of the system at some point. I would say to the point that, anyway, it's like at the point you got to college play, a lot of the assholes would have been weeded out in high school. Like, probably it's the people that follow the system enough, like code of conduct enough, that they wouldn't make it this thing where they're calling out these fouls that didn't happen. Like, it's the players that are following the rules or that actually play the game or try to fit in with the system or the game that's happening that would be rewarded. It's the assholes that would be shut out of the system over time. I don't think that that's really something you'd have to worry about, because you already see when it happens in pickup games that are refereed by the players. It's not like it goes to shit or anything. You don't need referees. So I don't really know. But anyways, there's certain fan bases that, like when Mark Few, Gonzaga's coach, when he's the biggest bitch on the floor, when he's more of a bitch than any of the referees are, when the referees are all bitches, they have to listen to the biggest bitch that's there. The referees, for whatever reason, are more affected by Gonzaga's coaching staff than other coaching staffs. Don't really know why, besides that Mark Few complains about everything and he has a kind of energy. A lot of times, home fan bases feed off of the energy of the head coach. That's just something that happens. You can see it happen. The energy of the head coach plays a big role in what the fan base says or how they react to the play on the floor. Mark Few is just a bitch and complains about literally everything the referees do. And in some respects, it helps to have a strong Christian faith that would cause you to think that you are better than the referees. I think it's maybe only like Christian crowds or Christian fan bases have more the opportunity to say that they're better than groups of people that identify themselves to be unbiased. But there's a certain fervency that happens with a Gonzaga crowd where they feel like they're better than the referees enough to just yell them into submission. Because I don't know if you I don't know if you've been around very Christian home fan bases before, and how they might react to how their team is playing, or how they react to the referee. But that group of people, like a very Christian home fan base, they're not submissive. That's one thing that they aren't. They're pretty dominant. And the more Christian it is, I would argue, the more dominant it is. But what's interesting is this trend that is happening in college basketball, where there's a lot of programs that are successful that are Christian, and has been trending that way over the last 20 years. Gonzaga is Catholic, and there is a certain integrity that comes along with that, but it's like over public universities like North Carolina or Duke, and maybe you would say that Duke is religious. They aren't. They are officially non-denominational. I looked it up. Their association is with the Methodist Church, but they're non-denominational. But it's like Gonzaga, this is a trend that's happening. But the crowd definitely affects Gonzaga games to the point that certain crowds are more above referees than other crowds, and they affect the game differently. It's not necessarily like a conspiracy, but this is a trend that you should talk about in sports, or that people should talk about, is the way that the crowd is narrating games and how much that affects the outcome of the game itself. But you, like a fan base like Gonzaga, they're so fervent and so all about their mission and like the integrity of their empire that's rising up in the West to challenge the system as we know it, challenge the Duke in North Carolina. And they're successful, they're winning. They just haven't won a championship yet, so they are out of their minds, yelling whatever, trying to win it just so they can prove that they are enacting their mission on the earth or whatever. I mean, then they have a strong Catholic faith, so they would believe that God is part of their college basketball thing. And maybe at some point, this is a more powerful way of governing a basketball program at all, as if you have some religious foundation, especially in a country that is becoming less religious, like especially in a country that the public universities maybe have less integrity than they did 20 years ago in comparison to Christian ones, which is definitely a possibility. At some point, maybe it actually helps to be Christian because you have greater integrity that's uniting you, especially in a world that's criticizing education and academia and universities. Like Wisconsin basketball is culty, or Michigan basketball is culty. It's religious on its own. Indiana basketball is a religious experience. It's a religion. Yeah. They're empires. Any one of them is an empire or a religion. And it's just that there is this trend where there's a lot of Christian teams that end up in the NCAA, turn in March Madness and do well, pull off upsets, and they all have, the Christian fan bases are all really fervent. They all have these fervent fan bases. And I feel like the epitome of this is Gonzaga, where it's like this new era of college basketball maybe relies on, maybe you need like a religious foundation or something like that, because it can be the trend that the emerging winners in a sport are people that just take advantage of the rules better than the previous generation of winners. Like maybe that's the way it always happens. Look at Donald Trump. He's very successful because he's working within the same system as everybody else, or he has to, but he finds loopholes in the system and makes a ton of money. He interprets the system in a way that profits him, but it's like takes advantage of the rules. I'd say that Gonzaga engages in a lot of taking advantage of the rules, and where they're like above the referees, but it's like it's a certain above you-ness maybe that they're able to put on as a result of what they believe. It's an authority that I'm watching play out for the Gonzaga fan base and coaching staff versus the referees, and it's an authority that affects the referees and affects the outcome of the game. And it's like not everybody would have that authority. It's an authority that they think they have that causes them to be above groups of people like referees that would say that they're unbiased. Like, for some reason, Gonzaga's fan base thinks they have the authority. They get to talk the referees into submission whenever they want. Maybe it's a result of their Catholicism. I don't know. Just some things to think about. And maybe as a result of it's better, some narratives are better than others, but it's like the paranormal things will never go mainstream because we can't fit that in with our story. They don't fit in with they seem to never get to that point, and it's because we have a story that we have to fit all of these things in with, or their narratives kind of have to be chalked up to one. I would say that in reality, everything is relative. There's so many stories going on at one time. It's better to go deeper and consider all of the possibilities that could have happened or something. I don't know. It's just when you make everything very obvious, or it's like you chalk it up to one conclusion, one summary, why something happened, one diagnosis, it becomes, it's more surface, but it's just like, that's the fashion in which we do things, so we can be remembered, whatever. Bye.